Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, written by the Hanged Man 317, and read by Purple Star. Chapter 27. Night had already fallen by the time Nezu was back in his office, sipping thoughtfully from a cup of his favorite blend of tea. The last couple of days had been trying. Dealing with the media was difficult at the best of times, always pushing and prying for a story to spin, and usually one that cast Yue in a poor light. There were only so many ways one could say, "We sincerely apologize, and we won't let this happen again," before the message started to ring a little hollow. Then there were the parents. Nezu sighed, setting down his cup and pulling over his laptop, paws hovering over the keyboard restlessly. It seemed like every single parent wanted a personal apology from the principal of UA himself, even if their child wasn't involved in the incident at all. He huffed as he checked through his emails, relieved that the influx of messages seemed to have slowed down to something more manageable. Humans. He had to admire their dedication. The instinct to protect children was one he could understand, after all. He was, first and foremost, a pro-hero and a teacher. But this was a bit of an extreme reaction, in his opinion. Perhaps it was the shock of discovering what their children would be up against, driving them to lash out at the nearest source of blame. Nezu leaned back in his office chair, feeling it loom over himself comically. On a normal day, this would amuse him enough to snap him out of such a funk, but now it was just distracting. Every single parent had decided to bring up their grievances with him personally, and it had an unsettling consequence of making him feel rather small. A conversation, a polite smile when it turned ugly, a comforting word if it brought tears. Over and over and over again. Exhausting. For every single child. Except one. Of course he was exaggerating, always one for dramatics. Nezu hummed and opened up his emails again to ensure he hadn't missed anything in the rush. There were a few students who hadn't been involved in the incident whose parents hadn't bothered to reach out to him, especially those from older classes, but this was a very, very notable exception. Suzuki Era had been kidnapped. She'd been held hostage, presumably threatened, been the only student to be hospitalized, and to top it all off, she wasn't even in the hero course. Of all the parents, Nezu would have expected hers to be the most furious. And yet, there was nothing in his inbox, no messages waiting for him on his phone. Nezu understood the instinct of a parent protecting their child, and as irritating as that was to deal with, the complete lack of it was all the more unnerving. It was an itch, and one he finally had time to scratch now that the media storm had calmed down from its bloodthirsty frenzy. First, he needed to figure out when she was kidnapped. She hadn't been in homeroom, which meant that it had to have happened sometime between when she left school the day before and when the first bell rang. It would probably be difficult to hide a child's disappearance for an entire night, so he would assume it had been when she'd left for school in the morning. Nezu pulled up his, probably criminal, access to a web of street cameras. Thankfully, nothing was illegal unless you got caught, and he was very adept at covering his tracks. It was simple. He had young Suzuki's address, so he would just have to find a camera that overlooked it, and scan through the footage until he saw her leaving her home and, presumably, her subsequent kidnapping. Obstacle number 1 presented itself almost immediately, as soon as he pulled up the camera feed. This was not a house. This was a post office. Against his more rational thoughts, Nezu felt the beginnings of a smile tug across his lips. Oh, so this was going to be one of those, then? No matter. It wasn't as if he was planning on going to sleep after all this commotion. He had all night. The address must have been a P.O. box, and though he could think of several legitimate reasons why that might be, there were also quite a few, far more tantalizing illegitimate ones that left his paws tapping restlessly against a keyboard. Perhaps it was just a mistake, an error of paperwork. Perhaps not. Fine then. Nezu flipped through the network until he found himself staring at grainy footage of the UA gates. Class had ended, and students were flooding out in a chaotic sea of uniforms and backpacks. Impossible to find her under all that noise. Nezu pulled out his second laptop and brought up the access information from all the keycards, finding the exact time that Suzuki had passed through the gates. Then he scrubbed through the footage to that timestamp and... there. He could just barely see her, but it seemed that she'd hung back a bit to avoid the crowd. Now that he had her, it was relatively simple work to track her through the city, though he did lose her for a moment when she stepped on the train. With the train schedule open, however, he was able to access station cameras that showed the train cars opening and people filing out at the time that her train should have arrived at each station. It took some time, but eventually he managed to pin her down a little further along the line, in a rundown section of Yokohama. Well, rundown was probably being generous. It was becoming difficult to find reliable camera feeds. In fact, it seemed as if several of the cameras that specifically marked Suzuki's route were either too damaged to properly display video, or were completely destroyed altogether. Interesting. He couldn't definitively call that malicious. There were just enough cameras off route that were also out of commission that he couldn't pin down her path just by that alone. Still, though, he couldn't call it malicious. Not yet. Nezu was grinning in earnest as he flipped through the camera feeds, sharp eyes scanning every grain and line for a hint of movement. The only thing he had on his side right now was the fact that there weren't a lot of people on the streets. Not in this section of the city. Suzuki would stand out in her uniform. Hours later, Nezu was starting to give up hope. He'd begun flipping through camera feeds idly as he formulated a new plan of attack. Perhaps he could send out a drone to tail her. A little inelegant, but at this point his curiosity was beginning to gnaw at him. Why was it so difficult to simply find out where she lived? It was pure, blind luck that he caught it. A flash of movement on the screen as he skipped by. Nezu hastily pulled up the feed, noting with interest a run-down laundromat and the figure that approached it. She walked right by the camera, medical mask hanging at her neck as she began to draw her hood up. Nezu tusked to himself, pausing the image and zooming in on her. Sloppy. It was Suzuki. He was almost positive. Scrolling back through her journey, it seemed that she'd walked out of the same dead zone she'd disappeared into. Now why ever would you be visiting a laundromat at 1 a.m? He mused to himself, fiddling with the feed so that it skipped forward and settling back to wait. As he suspected, Suzuki did not leave the building in the time it would take to do a load of laundry, or even 2. Not that she'd brought a bag in to begin with. What was she doing in there? Curiosity eating at him once again, Nezu leaned forward and began to flip through the feeds stationed around the laundromat in the vain hopes of catching a window or an open back door. Nothing, of course, but what he did find was far more interesting. Nezu clapped his paws together with a wide smile. Oh yes, this was quite a development. It seemed that the police and a few pro-heroes had arrived on the scene as well, and one of them was his very own Aizawa Shouta. Eraserhead, out of costume and gearing up to step into the building. A raid? Oh, how fascinating. Aizawa entered the laundromat as well, and Nezu watched with barely restrained glee until finally the team of heroes and officers descended on the building rather explosively. He'd have to pry this information out of someone somehow. He doubted he could get Aizawa to talk about it, but there must have been something in the police database. Not that he regularly perused such a thing. No matter, he'd figure that out later. For now, he was still creating a timeline for Suzuki. Speaking of which, there she was, bursting from the front of the building with... Was that Aizawa? Someone had clearly given him his capture scarf during the raid, and it billowed behind him as he raced after her. Oh, fantastic! Over rooftops and across alleyways, Nezu managed to keep a relatively decent eye on them throughout their pursuit. There was a puzzling moment when they disappeared from one rooftop to the next, but a security camera managed to catch Shizuki crashing to the ground in an alleyway. Another showing Aizawa rushing forward in an attempt to catch her with his capture weapon. Nezu sucked in a breath through his teeth as he automatically calculated the approximate force of that fall. Broken bones for sure, even if her role was rather expertly executed, and yet she got right back up and kept on running. Humming to himself, Nezu pulled up her files on his other monitor. Physical enhancement quirk. Sure. He'd be digging into that later. She disappeared into a bar, and Aizawa seemed to lose track of her. Nezu idly flipped through his cameras until he caught sight of her again, now wearing a hat and a completely new jacket, walking down the street as if she didn't have a care in the world. Simple but devilish. He liked it. The cameras along her route began to flicker out once more, but it was a little easier to keep track of her from this direction. It would have been impossible for her to eliminate every single... There. Got you! Nezu cheered, almost maniacally, paw victoriously landing upon an old, run-down camera that she must have missed. He ran back the footage to when she'd first arrived back home, confirming as she stepped into the apartment that this was, indeed, where she lived. Interesting, and quite honestly concerning, considering its appearance. The building looked like it should have had several dozen condemned signs slapped onto it already. Back to the present, or, well, past, future past, the time when Suzuki returned from her little escapade. She walked into frame just as a swirling pit of blackness opened up on the sidewalk beneath her. And then, just like that, she was gone. So Suzuki-era had, indeed, vanished the night before, and her parents had not raised any alarm. She had been missing from 4 a.m. to the time of the USJ attack. Something was very, very wrong. And despite it all, Nezu could not stop smiling. He leaned back and took a sip of his tea, grimacing when he discovered that it had long since gone cold. Busying himself with brewing another, Nezu let all of the facts jumble around in his head and weave themselves into a pretty little picture. Lies, criminals, intrigue, and all in the first couple of weeks of school. How exciting! Class 1A was already shaping up to be incredibly interesting, and now there was a new contender from 1C. Positively delightful. End of chapter 27.